The Senkaku Islands, a small collection of uninhabited islands west of Okinawa. They're little more than a collection of rocky outcroppings, and they might be among the most contested and controversial islands in Asia. How did these small islands become a flashpoint between Japan and China, and why are they now being fortified? The Senkakus are part of a larger chain called the Ryukyu Islands, which make up the tail end of Japan and brings the country's borders close to the coast of Taiwan. The Senkaku Islands are the furthest from the large islands of Japan, being under 200 miles from Taiwan, and while they may be small and play little overall role in running of the countries surrounding them, they have a long and complex history, one involving not just two countries, but four. How did it all begin? The islands played a key role long before they were considered officially part of any country as navigational markers. During this period, the Ryukyu Islands were the base of the Ryukyu Kingdom, a tributary state of the Ming Dynasty in China starting in 1429. Chinese delegations would use the Senkakus as key marking points for several hundred years and ruled the area until Japan started making a move. The Satsuma domain, a region controlled by the Tokugawa shogunate, successfully invaded the Ryukyu Islands and turned the kingdom into its own vassal state in 1609. This status quo lasted for over 200 years until the Empire of Japan formally annexed the region and the limited independence of the royals of the island was absorbed into the Japanese royal power structure. But the long hand of Europe was about to get involved as well. The Senkaku Islands, a small uninhabited collection of islands around 190 miles southwest of Okinawa, were mostly a location of convenience for the various empires that visited them and were called the Diaoyu Islands by Chinese writers. As more and more European explorers and traders started visiting the area, they took on the name Pinnacle Islands. But as interaction with Japan increased, the traditional name started to find greater use. But the islands weren't of much use to anyone. They had no resources that anyone knew of and were mostly used as useful navigational tools. Even after Japan annexed the area, not much changed until the region was plunged into war. The annexation happened during the First Sino-Japanese War, and soon the fast industrializing Japan realized that these islands could be put to use. Soon the Senkakus were home to a thriving bonito fish processing plant. Well, thriving for a short time at least. The islands were remote, and the Empire of Japan was more concerned with getting ready for war than propping up failing fish businesses. When the business closed around 1940, the Senkakus went back to being their usual deserted self. The islands remained owned by the same family for a while, but didn't provide any financial benefit to them, and they were about to get a new landlord because Japan was about to suffer a devastating defeat in the Second World War. And that meant the US was coming to town. The US occupied Japan in the aftermath of the war, and that included a long-term occupation of many islands. Okinawa was under formal occupation for almost 30 years until a treaty returning the islands to Japan was passed. The smaller islands, including the Senkakus, were a part of that treaty and returned to Japanese control in 1972. They are currently administered by the mayor of the island of Ishigaki, a thriving commercial island. But commercial development of the islands is prohibited by the central government of Japan. That's because the biggest dispute over the islands was about to kick off. It wasn't long before Japan's sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands was challenged by the Republic of China. With the islands so close to Taiwan, far closer than the major islands of Japan, the small island country felt it had a claim to them. And the tensions over the brutal Japanese occupation of parts of China during the Second World War were still red hot. Surprisingly, Taiwan's bitter rivals in the People's Republic of China backed their claim, with a caveat, because China backs Taiwan's claim while also claiming that Taiwan and everything that belongs to it is part of China, meaning that the Senkaku Islands would be as well. And this dispute hasn't been settled since. But what are these countries actually fighting over? Based on surveys, not much of anything. The island group is confirmed to consist of 5 small uninhabited islands, as well as 3 rocks that don't even qualify as islands. However, both China and Japan have done surveys which claim to reveal many more uninhabited islands and rocks. There have been very few visitors to the islands in recent years due to the political controversies, and even fewer documentations of what can be found there. However, the largest island, Yotsurishima, is said to have a pair of mountains with some vegetation. And while they're uninhabited, they're not fully barren. Records of plant life on the islands dates back to 1893 when Imperial China authorized an expedition to collect some herb samples. Since then, several surveys have revealed more than 330 species of plants on the largest island alone. Because of how few human visitors the islands have had in recent decades, the plant life is rarely disturbed, at least by humans. Animal life on the island is limited and heavily favors one specific type, the ones who can get there easily. Reports of large numbers of birds on the islands, especially the long-distance flying albatross, are common. The islands have even been designated as an important bird area by ecological organizations. The other common life forms are less welcome: mosquitoes and flies. However, they're not alone. Human intervention has placed other animals on the islands, with them staying there and making it their home. These include chickens, feral cats, and even goats. The most recent resident thanks to the work of a Japanese political group that believes the islands should be more aggressively used to assert Japan's claim. This resulted in the hungry goats going after the vegetation on the islands like goats do, impacting the ecological system for other native animals, including shrews, rats, and fruit bats. There are also a few small lizards and snakes on the island. It's a busy place, and many ecologically minded groups hope it'll be left alone by various competitors. Good luck with that. China believes that the islands are rightfully China's due to roots in the region dating back to 1534, but the islands were officially signed away by China in a treaty during the First Sino-Japanese War. However, this is complicated by the Potsdam Declaration, Japan's surrender at the end of the Second World War, which had the country surrender all islands outside of a few select stated in the agreement. China then claims that the later agreement to revert control of the islands like Okinawa does not override their historic claim. Historically, China has a strong claim to the islands. All the earliest references to the islands are Chinese, and China formally protested when the islands were returned to Japan. Japan's response is largely controversial. Japan insists that everything is above board. The islands are part of Japan, and they're not willing to negotiate. In fact, they dispute that the islands were ever specifically mentioned in Chinese texts, because the islands are so generic that it could have easily been another set of rocks. Most analysts don't agree with this conclusion, saying that the Chinese descriptions are highly specific, but Japan's legal claim is the one that carries more weight in the international law today, and few countries are willing to take China's side. But that doesn't mean it'll diffuse the conflict. For the most part, China and Japan do not seem willing to go to war over a collection of uninhabited islands, and mostly seem keen to just distribute propaganda supporting their claims. Japan released a website supporting its claims in 2012, and a Chinese propaganda film supporting China's side was released in 2014. Several court battles have been fought over the islands, and harsh words have been exchanged over the dispute, with Taiwan being quieter than the other two larger countries but asserting its own claim whenever it comes up. But as with any Cold War, it stands the risk of getting hot. What does it take to start a war? Actually, very little. A loose word from a diplomat or a foolish action by a fisherman can easily turn into an international incident, and it's happened more than once when it comes to the Senkaku Islands. The islands were calm for around 20 years after they were handed to Japan from the United States, but things have been escalating fast since then. The first incidents involved private citizens, such as a Hong Kong activist who attempted to swim to one of the islands and drowned in the attempt, becoming a martyr to those in China who believed they should be reclaimed by any means necessary. And he wouldn't be the only radical to try something like this. In both countries, there are hardline groups who believe that the country should be more assertive in the region. In the case of the Japanese radicals, they tend to come to the island and set up infrastructure or introduce wildlife. Some have built lighthouses there, and this is usually considered a hassle by the Japanese government, both because of the issues with disturbing the island's ecosystem and because when the islands are in the news, conflict with its neighbors is likely to follow. But this is a domestic affair. But the same can't be said for the other incursions. Japan claims the water around the islands as its exclusive economic zone, which is mostly relevant when it comes to fishing, and the waters are considered rich with high-value fish. This was confirmed in a 1997 fishing agreement that determined the boundaries, but Japan has the policy of not interfering with Chinese fishing boats in the region. Japan and Taiwan sorted out their own fishing rights in the region in a 2014 deal, but there's one big wrinkle in the region, and that wrinkle is spelled O-I-L. Is there oil hiding under the Senkaku Islands' territorial waters? No one is sure, but everyone wants to find out. The United Nations Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East first identified potential oil and natural gas reserves in the area in 1969, before the islands reverted to Japanese control. Since then, Chinese interest in the islands has massively increased, but no confirmed energy resources have been found yet. However, the odds are that investigation of these potential resources would be far more intense if there wasn't a territorial dispute with 3 countries in the region. And things have been ramping up a lot in recent years. Chinese and Taiwanese protesters have become increasingly bold in the 2000s, with activists frequently trying to land on the island. These are usually intercepted by Coast Guard vessels from Japan who turn them back. However, the proximity of Taiwan to the islands means that sometimes Taiwanese and Japanese Coast Guards can intersect or even collide. The protesters have often taken to jumping off their boats and trying to swim to shore when stopped, and are usually caught and deported. As a policy, Japan doesn't usually escalate too much when dealing with protesters or collisions between fishing vessels, instead briefly detaining the people involved and releasing them. Japan has even apologized and paid compensation when they were found to be at fault in collisions with civilian fishing vessels. But these were small-scale events. The year was 2010 when the biggest flashpoint in the conflict occurred. A large Chinese fishing vessel trawler entered the disputed waters and was ordered to stop for inspection. Instead, the ship refused the orders and attempted to flee, crashing into several Japanese Coast Guard vessels. The Japanese forces boarded the ship, arrested the captain and 14 people on board for illegal fishing and obstruction, and took them back to Japan for detention. According to Japan, it was a clear-cut case of a rogue ship in its territory. But China disagreed and made itself known. China condemned the arrest, claiming the fishing vessel was illegally intercepted, and summoned the Japanese ambassador for a series of increasingly intense talks. While the boat and the 14 crew members were released after less than a week, the captain was held for over 2 weeks before being released. This wasn't enough for China, as they demanded an apology and compensation. This following a series of escalations by China, including threats in front of the United Nations and the detention of several Japanese businessmen, was successful. In China, it was seen as a victory to force Japan to release everyone involved, while the government in Japan was heavily criticized for giving in so quickly. And it would be the first of many escalations. Since then, Japan has increased patrols in the region, with more Japanese fishing vessels entering to fish and assert Japanese sovereignty over the region. A conservative political group, Ganbare Nippon, has engaged several high-profile protests in the area and tried to approach the islands to plant Japanese flags. But these have all been civilian disruptions, and Japan has largely stopped most of the protesters. After all, there's no reason to start another diplomatic incident if you don't have to. But in recent years, China might be giving them no choice. The reason things are escalating now is because the conflict has shifted from private incursions and diplomacy to direct Chinese military provocations. Starting in 2012, Chinese and Taiwanese government and military flights started entering the airspace over the Senkaku Islands. Japan's Air Force scrambled and the country issued a protest, but it didn't deter the Chinese. But surprisingly, the most direct conflict didn't come with Chinese vessels, it came against Taiwanese ships. It was a tense standoff, and also a little silly. It was September 2012 when 75 Taiwanese fishing vessels and 10 Coast Guard boats approached the island and were met by Japanese Coast Guard ships. Threats were issued and neither side backed off, so the two groups fired, with water cannons to try to drive off the other side. A combination of LED lights and loudspeakers were used to broadcast claims of dominance and territorial rights, in what most analysts said was a loud, flashy standoff that neither side actually wanted to descend into a shooting war. But China also joined in on the fun. The escalation of Chinese military intervention in the region was worrisome for many nations, especially once they saw China sending armed planes and vessels into the region to lock in on Japanese vessels. China claimed it was a routine training exercise, but the US disputed that, revealing that China had been moving ballistic missiles into the region. Japan threatened to shoot down Chinese drones. China responded and said this would be an act of war, and the tensions escalated for a while. Starting in 2014, the issue seemed to fade off the front page as Chinese activity in the region declined and the status quo carried on. But nothing good lasts forever. In 2020, when everyone had other things on their mind, Chinese government vessels started entering the disputed areas much more frequently. In fact, Japan reported that there had been a streak of at least 67 days in a row with incursions, and as of 2022, there was a new reason for concern. China wasn't alone anymore. As China and Russia grew closer after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and subsequent isolation by much of the world, the two great powers increased military cooperation, and Japan was shocked when a Russian frigate entered its territorial waters on June 4th. Not only were the Chinese and Russian vessels back, but they were acting with increasing confidence, with some staying for several days in a row as if to dare Japan to do something about it. And it's no surprise Japan has responded. Japanese diplomatic protests to China fell on deaf ears, as the provocation was likely the point of their actions. So Japan has sought out help from its allies, something that became all the more essential when China included the islands in a new air defense identification zone. This was ostensibly a way to guard against potential air threats, but functioned as a way to intimidate not just Japan, but the United States, which had been flying more Air Force jets through the area with Japan's permission. A high-stakes game of brinksmanship began as China began ordering Japanese and American planes to identify themselves as they flew through what was internationally recognized as Japanese territory. They refused, and China wisely refrained from attempting to enforce its zone with military force, but the standoff continued. And escalation has continued. While both Taiwan and China claim the islands, the two have differed wildly in how far they're willing to go. With only 41% of Taiwan residents willing to fight a war over the Senkaku Islands, 91% of mainland Chinese respondents say they are, and China has played to that sense of patriotism, in 2021 passing a law authorizing the Coast Guard to use lethal force in conflicts over territorial waters. In response, Japan has been increasing its own presence, constructing radar stations in the area, and launching larger and more advanced patrol vessels to fend off incursions. This is all a game of inches in Asia, but there are some recent indications that things have changed. The Senkaku Islands aren't alone anymore in being encroached on by China. In the last few years, China's become more aggressive about asserting claims in disputed areas or other countries' territorial waters, primarily in the South China Sea. This has led to other countries, including Vietnam and the Philippines, forging closer ties with the US to fend off China. All the while, China not just lays claim to these waters, but transforms small reefs into built-up artificial islands equipped with missile defenses that aim to turn them into Chinese property by implied threat alone. And Japan no doubt fears the same fate for the Senkaku Islands, something Taiwan wouldn't be happy about either. After all, Taiwan is China's ultimate reach goal in the region, and the mainland threatens war with the small island nation regularly. So now it might be time to fight fire with fire. Japan has one key tool in its arsenal against China: the US-Japan Security Treaty, which is designed to protect Japan from a Chinese invasion as part of Japan's agreement to give up its own military capacity in the aftermath of World War II. While Japan has been building up its own military in recent years, it still relies heavily on US protection. But whether this protection applies to the Senkaku Islands will likely depend heavily on just how far Japan is willing to go to hold on to these rocky outcroppings. And the answer seems to be pretty far. The Senkaku Islands are pretty bare of infrastructure, but that is slowly changing, and in March 2023, Japan took its biggest step yet, completing a new military base in the area and moving in some powerful forces. This isn't on the Senkaku Islands. Those are so small that a military base there would make no sense. Rather, the base is located on nearby Ishigaki, around 200 kilometers away from the Senkaku Islands. Ishigaki is a very different place from the Senkakus, currently a thriving vacation spot popular with scuba divers. And now, it's popular with soldiers as well. Around 570 ground self-defense force members from Japan's most elite fighting forces have moved into the new base camp. And while Japan hasn't exactly said what they're there to do, it's clear to all observers. They're there to spring into action if China makes a move on the Senkaku Islands. And it seems likely that Japan means business, because these aren't just soldiers, they include missile squads who will be among the first line of defenses in a war, launching a barrage of surface-to-air missiles. And this is part of a much larger trend. The Okinawa region of Japan has been a massive hub of military growth in recent years, with Japan opening up 4 bases since 2016 alone, all on islands in the region. While previous bases have had smaller contingents of troops, most of the bases also include missile deployments, making it very clear that while Japan isn't looking to start a conflict, they're ready to fight one if it comes to it. Japan's military leadership was interviewed and made clear that it was ready to defend its territory if need be, which is a big change for a country that has been cursed by its history. No country has been transformed more by losing a war than Japan, going from a military powerhouse ruled by an emperor to a pacifist democracy that has lacked a full standing army until recent years. But that agreement, which allowed Japan to only have a self-defense force, was largely administered by the US and its allies, and all of them shared the same concern about China's growing aggressive presence in the South China Sea and beyond. So, as Japan begins to fortify for a potential war, the US is willing to look the other way and even aid Japan as it embarks on its biggest military increase in decades. But is there an endgame here? Is Japan's new military force capable of fending off a Chinese invasion of the Senkaku Islands? If China prepares for an attack, probably not. China has the second most powerful army in the world at the moment and is building up to compete with the US. By comparison, Japan is only beginning a build-up. So if a conflict was to break out, Japan is likely banking heavily on US assistance, which would likely be coming barring a major change in US leadership that would take the country in an isolationist direction. But just because you can't win a conflict doesn't mean you can't prevent it. The Senkaku Islands are valuable to Japan both strategically and from a political perspective. Taking them brings China closer to Taiwan from another angle, making it easier to cut the small island nation off from supplies brought by allies. This may be the primary reason why China wants the islands, but it would also be a massive PR victory in the region. Japan is the most powerful country besides China in East Asia, and showing that China could intimidate Japan into giving up the islands or not retaliating when they're captured could go a long way to convincing other players in the region that China cannot be opposed. Which is why a show of force early is key. It might sound like a playground rule, but finders keepers actually does play a key role in international relations. If a territory is actively contested, it's common for support to rush to the invaded party and prolong the conflict inevitably. That's what happened in Ukraine, when the Eastern European country fended off an early attempt to encircle Kyiv and take control of the country, and Western money and weapons flooded in, allowing Ukraine to hold Russia at bay for over a year. However, in the eastern Ukrainian areas Russia did take, Putin quickly annexed them, held sham referendums, and declared that attempting to take them back would be the equivalent of invading Russia. And a similar thing could play out in Japan. The Senkaku Islands have no defenses on site because the islands are too small for a full-time military presence to be posted on them. However, defending them from the main Japanese islands wouldn't work either because a full-fledged Chinese invasion could potentially take the islands before Japan could respond, and then declare that any resistance would be attacking Chinese islands. On the other hand, Japan's current approach, fortifying some of the larger islands near the Senkaku Islands, allows Japan to arrive on site much faster, potentially engaging the Chinese military before they can claim the islands, and making the People's Republic of China decide if they're truly ready for an all-out war over some rocks in the sea. Which means that these disputed rocks may continue to be occupying everyone's mind in the region for a long time. How far does China plan to take this? Check out China's plan to take over the world for a look into Xi Jinping's dream journal, or watch this video instead.